The excavation machine roared against the bedrock of San Michel, a tiny island in the sapphire expanse of the Mediterranean Sea. For years, this rock had been the domain of wild goats and the few stubborn souls who refused to leave its sun-baked shores. Progress, in the form of a multinational resort corporation, had finally arrived. The crew raced against the clock, clearing the foundation for a luxury hotel that would boast infinity pools and private villas. The air tasted of salt and diesel. On a Tuesday afternoon under a merciless sun, the digger's claw bit into the earth near an ancient gnarled olive tree. The operator felt the vibration first, a jarring thud that was wrong. He killed the engine and climbed down, expecting a large boulder. Instead, emerging from the rubble like a pale accusation, was a human hand. The bones were clean, bleached by time, but the silver wedding band on one finger still glinted dully in the sunlight. The foreman ordered everyone back, his face ashen. He called the authorities on the mainland, his voice trembling as he described what they had unearthed. Within hours, a police boat cut through the gentle waves, carrying officers who had no idea they were about to open a Pandora's box that the island had kept sealed for over 40 years. The idyllic construction site became a crime scene, cordoned off with yellow tape that fluttered in the warm breeze. The earth had given up its dead, and the silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the machines had ever been. The initial assessment by the forensic team from the mainland confirmed the worst. It was not one body, but 5. They were arranged in a rough circle, as if in some grim council, all buried at a depth of about 6 feet. The soil's unique chemical composition had mummified the remains, preserving crucial details. All 5 individuals had been shot. The wounds on the skulls were consistent with close-range executions. Their hands were bound behind their backs with a thick coarse twine that was still partially intact. Clothing fragments suggested a time frame: denim, heavy cotton, and a style of leather shoe popular in the late 1970s and early 1980s. This was no ancient cemetery. This was a mass grave from a more recent and clearly violent past. The discovery sent a tremor through the island's tiny population. San Michel had always been portrayed as a sleepy, forgotten paradise. Its history was one of fishing, quiet summers, and simple living. This revelation painted a very different picture. Detective Marco Rossi, a pragmatic man from the mainland city core, was put in charge of the investigation. He stood at the edge of the pit, looking not at the bones, but at the island beyond. A single dusty road led to a small village. On the hill overlooking the village and the new construction site stood the Hotel Vittoria. It was a grand pale yellow building from another era, with shuttered windows and a fading sign. It was the only hotel the island had ever had. For Marco, it was the only place to start. The Hotel Vittoria was a relic, a beautiful ghost of a bygone age. Its owner, Elena Rossi, was a woman of about 80, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, tending to the hotel's small garden or sitting on the wide veranda watching the sea. Her guests were not tourists but regulars, elderly couples who had been coming for decades, treating the place like a second home. When Marco and his team arrived, she received them with quiet, calm dignity. She offered them cool lemonade and answered their initial questions without hesitation. Yes, she had been on the island since the late 60s. Yes, she remembered the old days when fishing boats outnumbered people. The victims? No, she didn't recognize the clothing or the few personal effects recovered, like the silver ring and a broken wristwatch. Her memory, she said with a sigh, was not what it used to be. Marco felt a chill that had nothing to do with the lemonade. Her eyes were too sharp for a woman with a failing memory. He asked about the hotel's records, guest registries from that era. Elena said they had been lost in a small fire years ago. A fire that had also damaged the old storage room. He looked past her into the cool dark lobby. On the wall hung a large framed black and white photograph of the hotel in its prime, packed with well-dressed guests. A much younger Elena stood behind the reception desk, smiling. It was the smile of someone in control. Marco knew with a certainty that settled in his bones that the answers were here, locked within these old walls and behind those knowing eyes. The investigation on the mainland into missing persons from the late 70s and early 80s yielded a list. 5 names, 5 ghosts. A small-time jewel thief from France, a German accountant who had embezzled from his firm, an Italian politician's aide who had vanished with sensitive documents, a wealthy British playboy known for his gambling debts, and a low-level enforcer for a Marseille crime family. They were not innocents. They were people who lived on the fringes, whose disappearances had been noted but not deeply investigated, often written off as them fleeing their messy lives. They all had one thing in common: they had all been in the general vicinity of the Mediterranean during the summers in question. But the link to San Michel was still missing. There were no ferry records, no witnesses. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Then a junior officer found a small classified advertisement in a niche European travel magazine from 1979. It was for the Hotel Vittoria on San Michel, pitching it as a discreet getaway far from the mainland's prying eyes. The tagline was simple: for guests who value their privacy above all else. Marco read the line again. Privacy above all else. It wasn't a promise of a quiet holiday. It was an invitation. An invitation for people who needed to disappear, if only for a while. People who couldn't go to the police if something went wrong. People who wouldn't be missed. The hotel wasn't just a building. It was a perfect isolated trap. With this new theory, Marco returned to San Michel, this time with a warrant to search the hotel's grounds. The excavation team, now working under police supervision, expanded their search. Near the old olive tree they found more. Not bodies, but objects. A tarnished cigarette case with the French thief's initials. A signet ring bearing the British playboy's family crest. A belt buckle. These were personal items, things that wouldn't have been buried with the bodies. They were like trophies or tokens, buried separately. Marco stood before Elena Rossi in the hotel's library, a room filled with dusty books. He laid the evidence before her. The advertisement, the photographs of the newly found items. All of them were guests there. All of them came to hide and never left. Elena looked at the items, her expression unchanged. She acknowledged they were guests, troubled people who came and went, but claimed no responsibility for them. Marco pressed harder. 5 men with criminal backgrounds, all buried on her property, all executed. He demanded to know who did this. For the first time, a flicker of something not fear but profound weariness crossed her face. She spoke of the island taking care of its own. It was not an answer but an epitaph. Marco knew he was dealing with someone who had long ago made peace with her past, whatever it was. He needed more than physical evidence. He needed to understand the mind that could preside over such a place. The break in the case came not from the ground but from the past. A meticulous search of the hotel uncovered a hidden compartment in the floorboards of Elena's private quarters. Inside there was no money or jewels. There were 5 leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed and covered in elegant faded handwriting. They were Elena Rossi's diaries. Marco took them back to the mainland and began to read. The entries from the late 70s detailed a woman in her 30s running a hotel on an isolated island with her elderly father. It was a hard, lonely life. But the tone changed with the arrival of the first guest, the French jewel thief. Elena wrote of him with contempt. He was arrogant and loud, treating her like a servant. She described overhearing him boast about a woman he had cheated, a woman who had later taken her own life. A few nights later, an entry described a violent storm and mentioned that the sea would claim its own, and that she and her father had to bury a few things in the garden to keep the island pure. Marco's blood ran cold. He read on. Each journal detailed the arrival of another man, another criminal. And each time Elena would learn their secrets, either by listening or by finding their personal effects. She would watch them, judge them, and find them wanting. She saw them not as guests but as a contagion on her island. The entries were not those of a killer driven by madness, but by a chilling self-appointed moral code. The diaries painted a terrifyingly clear picture of a woman who had created her own system of justice. She never killed anyone she deemed innocent, or even those simply running from bad luck. Her victims were in her eyes the truly wicked. The German accountant had not just embezzled money. The diaries revealed Elena's belief that his greed had led to a family's ruin and a subsequent suicide. The Italian politician's aide had stolen documents to cover up a crime, not to expose it. The British playboy had a history of violent abusive relationships that money had always made disappear. And the Marseille enforcer had a trail of blood across the continent. Elena saw herself as a cleansing agent. Her island would not be a sanctuary for such men. She wrote of a profound sense of peace after each cleansing. The method was always the same: a quiet late-night meeting in the hotel's library, a single gunshot from a small-caliber pistol she kept for protection, and then the long arduous task of burial beneath the old olive tree. Her father was a silent partner, a man of few words who loved his daughter and the island with fierce, unquestioning loyalty. He helped her dig. He helped her carry the truth. He died in 1985, and Elena continued her work alone until the stream of such men, drawn by that discreet ad, eventually dried up. Armed with the diaries, Marco returned to San Michele for a final confrontation. He found Elena in her garden watering her tomato plants. She looked up, saw the box under his arm, and simply nodded. She didn't ask what it was. She knew. They sat on the veranda with the sea glittering before them. Marco read passages back to her, his voice steady. She listened, her face a mask of serene acceptance. She described them as wicked men. In her view, the world was full of wicked men who hid behind money and laws. There on the island there were no laws but hers. No police station, no court. Just her and her father and the olive tree. She explained her logic with a terrifying clarity that left Marco speechless. She felt no guilt, only a deep satisfaction of a duty fulfilled. She had protected her home. She had dispensed a justice she felt the world was too corrupt to deliver. When Marco asked what gave her the right, she compared herself to a storm striking a ship. It was in her nature. She was the island, and the island had decided. There was no malice or madness. Just a profound and absolute certainty that what she had done was right. It was the most terrifying thing Marco had ever witnessed. The arrest was quiet. Elena Rossi did not resist. She walked to the police boat with the same calm dignity with which she had tended her garden. The story broke internationally, a perfect storm of elements, a beautiful isolated location, a cast of unsavory victims, and a beautiful elderly female killer with a philosopher's justification. It captivated the world. But as the legal machine began to turn, a problem emerged. The physical evidence was the bodies and the buried items. The motive was laid out in Elena's diaries. But the legal proof, the direct link between Elena and the trigger, was shaky. There were no fingerprints on the long-lost gun, which was never found. The bullets corroded by decades in the soil could not be definitively matched to any weapon. Her father, her only accomplice and witness, was dead. The diaries were a confession, but her lawyer argued they were the fantasies of a lonely elderly woman, a fiction she had created to give her dull life meaning. Could the prosecution prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Elena Rossi, and not her long-dead father, had fired the shots? Could they prove it wasn't the father who acted alone, with Elena merely an accessory after the fact, burying the bodies to protect him? The perfect crime had left behind a perfect legal ambiguity. The trial became a media circus, a philosophical debate about justice, morality, and the letter of the law. The trial was held on the mainland in a packed courtroom. Elena sat serenely in the dock, dressed in simple black, looking more like a grandmother attending a solemn function than a serial killer facing life in prison. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold, calculating vigilante who had taken the law into her own hands. They presented the diaries as a roadmap of premeditated murder, reading aloud the most chilling passages. They brought in forensic experts to testify that the bindings on the victim's hands were made with a type of twine sold on the island, easily accessible to Elena. The defense, led by a sharp young lawyer named Anna, countered brilliantly. She argued that Elena's father, a burly taciturn man with a known temper, was the likely perpetrator. She suggested that Elena, out of misplaced loyalty and a desire to protect his memory, had written the diaries to absorb the guilt. The lawyer pointed to Elena's frail appearance and asked whether she seemed capable of executing 5 men and burying them in the night. The diaries, she argued, were a work of fiction, a psychological coping mechanism. The real killer, the one with the physical strength and the presumed temperament, was in the grave and beyond the reach of the court. The jury was left to ponder which version of events matched the evidence. The prosecution's case hinged on one crucial piece of testimony: Detective Marco Rossi. They put him on the stand to attest to the authenticity of Elena's demeanor and the consistency of her confession to him. Marco described their conversation on the veranda, her chilling calm, her admission that she was the island. Under direct examination, his testimony was damning. He was a credible, seasoned detective. But then came the cross-examination from Anna. She was relentless. She questioned whether Elena's calm demeanor could just as easily signify relief at being freed from a decades-long lie told to protect someone else. She asked about the missing murder weapon and the lack of forensic evidence placing Elena's finger on a trigger. Marco had to admit the gun was never found. She then brought up Elena's father, a known hunter on the island who owned several rifles and handguns. Marco confirmed this. The defense lawyer turned to the jury and summarized the situation. The prosecution had a motive and a story, but no weapon, no physical proof, and a defendant whose only confession was a written fantasy and a calm demeanor that could just as easily signify innocence as guilt. The reasonable doubt was planted firmly in the minds of the jurors. The jury deliberated for 6 days. The world waited. The case had sparked countless debates online and in the media. Was Elena a hero who had cleansed the world of monsters, or was she a monster herself? The legal question, however, was far simpler. Was there proof beyond a reasonable doubt? On the 7th day, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The foreman, a middle-aged man with a grim face, stood to deliver the verdict. On the charge of 5 counts of first-degree murder, the jury found the defendant not guilty. A gasp went through the courtroom. Elena Rossi showed no emotion. Her lawyer slumped in her chair, a wave of relief washing over her. The prosecutor looked stunned. The verdict was not a moral acquittal. It was a legal one. The reasonable doubt sown so effectively by the defense had taken root. They could not be sure she was the one who pulled the trigger. Elena Rossi was free to go. She walked out of the courthouse into a blaze of camera flashes, a free woman. She said nothing to the reporters, her blue eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Marco Rossi standing at the back. She gave them a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was not a nod of thanks or victory. It was a nod of acknowledgement between two people who knew the truth, even if the law could not prove it. Elena Rossi returned to San Michele. The resort construction had been halted and the island was quiet again. She walked back into the Hotel Vittoria, a place that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. A few months later, a letter arrived at Detective Marco Rossi's office. It had no return address, but the postmark was from the island's mainland ferry terminal. Inside was a single small key and a handwritten note on faded Hotel Vittoria stationery. The note contained just 3 words: the library floor. Marco understood. He made the journey back to San Michele one last time. The hotel was empty. Elena was gone. He found her in the garden beneath the old olive tree. She had passed away peacefully in her sleep, a book open on her lap. It was one of her journals. After the authorities had taken her body, Marco went into the library. Using the key, he opened a floor panel he had missed before, one so cleverly crafted it was invisible. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small rusted pistol. Beside it lay a photograph. It was a picture of Elena as a young woman standing proudly next to her father in front of the hotel. On the back, in her elegant handwriting, was a date from 1985, the year he died, and a simple sentence: "The last stone is laid. Now the earth holds all our secrets." Marco sat in the silent library for a long time, holding the key and the photograph. He had his final undeniable proof. But it changed nothing. Elena had orchestrated everything, even her own legacy. She had ensured that the only person left to blame, the one with the strength and the temperament, was already gone. She had taken the full truth to her grave, leaving behind only the unanswered question that would forever cling to her story: was she a guardian angel or a fallen one? The island and the earth beneath it would never tell.